are going to be talking about Han Kang, the first Korean and Asian woman Nobel Laureate in literature. She is a Korean female writer who has been working for decades now. She was born in 1970, so she's in her 50s. And she has been writing since she was a very young girl. And she has a very large corpus of her works that we only know a very little of in the English-speaking world. However, her literature has garnered much critical acclaim as well as popular praise from the readers. Han Kang is a writer who is very sensitive to issues pertaining to women and gender. Her writing, in particular The Vegetarian, takes up a female figure who turns into a vegetarian instead, and she basically bans meat from her diet. But this is a metaphor for a larger rejection of the patriarchal society. Thus, I think Han Kang is a writer, a novelist who questions power, gender power in Korean society. She is very sensitive to issues pertaining to the ways that women have been oppressed through Korean history and historical moments. Her novels also address genders in terms of the kind of pain that women in particular experience. And this is not just physical pain, but also emotional and psychological pain. And these are all presented through her very powerful prose style. In terms of thinking about gender, temporality, and in particular related to Korean historical issues, what Han Kang does is she resuscitates these repressed histories, especially repressed histories pertaining to women. Thus, for example, Gwangju, in the historiography of Gwangju, women and women's roles are largely left out in that writing of Korean history, whereas her literature brings women and women's very important role into the center of her novels. So I brought both the English translation as well as the Korean original here. Two of the main characters are young girls. One is they both experienced the Gwangju uprising or the Gwangju revolution as young women, and the novel traces their experiences at that moment as well as in the aftermath of Gwangju incidents. So for example, one of the characters becomes a factory girl, and she is not only oppressed during the time that she lived through the Gwangju incident in the novel, but even afterwards, when she becomes an adult, she is doubly oppressed. And this also shows that Korean society has not progressed or moved towards modernity that is supposed to allow women, young people, a sense of freedom through financial liberation, as well as, of course, the sense of freedom that comes with being a human being. The style in which Han Kang writes and the style in which she was commended for by the Nobel Prize Committee is certainly very poetic, and it's quite powerful in that her writing style is not ostentatious or flowery, I would say. Her writing style is quite terse at times, and that terseness, we find that the way that she gives voice to the marginalized, the oppressed, is made even more powerful. To give an example from The Human Acts, the chapters are divided into different narrators. It's narrated from different characters' perspective, and each chapter, in fact, at least in the original Korean, you can really hear the character's voice in the way that perhaps the voice of the factory girl it does actually reveal the kinds of trauma she has experienced or is experiencing, and the kinds of contradictions that she must live through. And that is represented through the way that she uses, for example, verbs or even the sentence length, as though there, between those branches, the wind is about to take on a visible form, as to the raindrops suspended in the air, held beneath before the plunge, are on the cusp of trembling down, glittering like jewels. When you open your eyes properly, the trees' outlines dim and blur. You're going to need glasses before long. This thought gets briefly disturbed by the whooping and the applause that breaks out from the direction of the fountain. Han Kang's place in Korean literary history is certainly been lofted into a different stage as a result of her winning of the Nobel Prize in Literature. However, she comes from a long lineage of Korean writers who are writing about, of course, Korean's traumatic history, whether it stems from the Japanese colonial era in the early 20th century to the experiences of the Korean War, and of course the domestic violence that was also associated with the Korean War, and then through military dictatorship, and then through the fighting for democracy in the late 20th century, and then of course as we move into the 21st century, how is this the state of democracy and the state having arrived at a certain level of modernity, how are people in Korea still dealing with the effects of globalization that has now embroiled Korea into even deeper networks of oppression? Han Kang fits into this long lineage of modern Korean writers who are writing perhaps in this realist mode, I would say, a realist mode, a realism that had perhaps returned in the 1970s and 1980s with writers who are writing against and protesting against the military government in the 1970s and 80s. Han Kang's archive is not specific to the Korean national history per se, in that she uses the local setting, the local conditions, and the local events, I think, to extrapolate about and comment about the world conditions. So her location of Korea is certainly important, but it can resonate to readers and people from different places around the world who are undergoing, for example, war, who are undergoing, women who are undergoing oppression. I think that's one of the reasons why, very interestingly, one of the first responses that Han Kang had in being awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature was that, thank you, but this is not a time for a celebration when there are still wars happening in the Ukraine and in Gaza. And so I think she shares her concerns not only for what was happening in Korea or what had happened in Korea, but her writing and her art can very easily translate into the kind of conditions that are being perpetuated in different parts of the world. And thus, the kind of literature that she writes might be called trauma literature that has been taken up by many, in particular, women writers. However, while I would say that her writing and her novels and her art is specific and local, it also addresses various global conditions that opens up trauma as not only being local, but to the conditions that everyone in the world, in their global community, should be aware of and be concerned about.